Hey guys, tonight we're going to slip into a world where the hearth glows dim and the air tastes of rosemary and ash. You're standing in a kitchen so old the floorboards creak under your bare feet, and every shelf is crowded with jars, crushed pennyroyal leaves, sprigs of rue and sticky globs of something that might be honey or might be poison. It's the year 1386, give or take, and your life depends on remembering which little bundle keeps a baby out of your belly. Because if you get it wrong, you'll end up with more than just a scolding from the priest. You'll probably lose everything you have. You probably won't survive this if we're honest. So, before we drift any deeper, if this hushed little corner brings you even a flicker of calm, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it feels right in your chest. Wherever you are, whisper your location and your local time in the comments. Someone out there will see it, and know they're not the only night owl. Now, breathe slow. Let the weight fall off your shoulders, and sink with me into tonight's slow unraveling of the past. Right here on Historian's Diary, you trudge across the packed earth floor to the hearth, watching the embers breathe. You can almost hear the murmured instructions of a mother to her daughter, or an old midwife to her apprentice. A pinch of savin before sunrise, swallow it with cold ale. No one writes these things down because parchment is too precious, and because some knowledge is safer kept in memory than in ink. When you pinch a bit of tansy between your fingers, its scent is bright and bitter, like crushed green apples. Tansy was a popular herb for centuries, praised for its usefulness in driving away unwanted guests. Women dried it in bunches, ground it fine, and stirred it into bread dough or beer. They'd pass it off as just another flavouring, though everyone in the village knew exactly why you were adding it to your morning loaf. You might think that sounds a little too convenient, but remember, this was a world where a single mistake could mean pregnancy, shame, or death in childbirth. So you'd better believe women learned which plants could bend nature's plans. Even Pliny the Elder, the Roman naturalist, whose work lingered in medieval manuscripts, catalogued herbs with abortifacient properties. By the 14th century, those old recipes had woven into Christian Europe like ivy creeping into a crumbling wall. Still, no one ever felt completely safe relying on these kitchen remedies. A woman might whisper to her neighbour that pennyroyal tea never failed her, but the truth was more complicated. Too little, and it did nothing. Too much, and it could stop your heart before it ever stopped a pregnancy. You'd stir your cup and wonder which fate you'd chosen. That's the grim little reality. Some so-called herbal cures were more lethal than the problem they promised to fix. You watch as a young girl shuffles to the hearth, wrapping her shawl tighter. She's no more than 15, but her belly's already rounding beneath her homespun dress. You can see in her eyes she's desperate. She didn't brew her tansy tea soon enough. Maybe she was afraid, or maybe the plant lost its strength drying by the rafters. Either way, she's out of options. You'd like to imagine the village midwife could help her. And sometimes, yes, there were women, practical, sharp-eyed, endlessly patient, who kept the old knowledge alive. They'd slip you a bundle of rue or a bottle of oil infused with wild carrot seeds. They'd murmur, "Take this before the next moon," and look away so you wouldn't have to meet their gaze. It was an uneasy alliance. The community needed babies to survive, but it also needed women strong enough to work the fields. Not every pregnancy was celebrated. Overhead, the beams are dark with smoke. Some evenings you'd hear women up there, drying herbs in the rafters and weaving them into little sachets. A pinch under the tongue, a poultice on the belly, a fumigation to open the womb, all part of the hidden arsenal. And because you're clever and perhaps a touch reckless, you'd memorize every detail. You'd never admit it openly, but you'd prefer to gamble on a bundle of bitter leaves than on the promise of a man's restraint. There's something almost comforting in this quiet rebellion. In a time when bishops preached about a woman's sacred duty to multiply, the hearth became a place where that duty could be quietly negotiated or refused altogether. In the same pot where you boiled supper, you could brew freedom, or at least the illusion of it. If you were wealthier, you might buy your herbs from an apothecary in the nearest town. Their shelves gleamed with imported spices, cinnamon, cloves, little wax jars labelled in Latin, but most likely you'd pick your plants yourself, stooping in a meadow or along the hedgerow, heart beating too fast in case anyone saw you. And when you returned home, you'd have to explain why your apron smelled like marjoram and mugwort. You'd mutter something about cough remedies and hope no one asked further questions. By the flickering firelight, you might study the sprigs laid out on the table, feeling the weight of generations pressing behind your shoulders. These recipes didn't spring up overnight. They were centuries deep, older than the manor house itself. You'd think about all the nameless women who tested, tasted, and sometimes died so you could inherit their secrets. And if you ever doubt how serious this was, remember, medieval English law sometimes punished the use of abortive herbs as homicide. If you were caught, you'd be dragged before a court. The neighbours would whisper, the priest would look away, and you'd feel your life contract to a single point of shame. That's the gamble. One handful of leaves, and you might regain control over your future or lose everything. It's easy to romanticize these women as herbal wise women in their smoky kitchens, but when you imagine the girl at the hearth tonight, skin pale, eyes wide, you understand how desperation drove these choices, a future she couldn't afford growing beneath her ribs, a life she never asked for curling into shape. Outside the door, the wind shifts. It smells of damp earth and the last warmth of the sun. You wonder if she'll slip away before dawn to find someone willing to help her, or if she'll drink her pennyroyal tea and pray her heart is strong enough to survive it. And you, standing in the hush of this kitchen, feel that old tension, the yearning for agency and the fear of consequence echo like a heartbeat between the rafters. You step outside the kitchen, into the cold breath of the alley, and pull your cloak tighter around your shoulders. The sky above you is low and iron-coloured, promising rain before dawn. You follow a crooked lane that winds past timbered cottages and dung heaps until you reach a door marked by a crude symbol, two interlaced circles, etched in chalk. Some say it's a merchant's mark, others know it's a sign that inside you'll find charms against conception if you know how to ask. Tonight you're curious enough to push that door open. Inside, the air is thick with dried lavender and a sharper, acrid undertone you can't quite place. The woman who meets your gaze looks older than the century itself, her eyes pale as milk glass. She doesn't greet you, just studies your face as if she can already tell why you've come. Her hands disappear into a drawer, and when they re-emerge, she's holding a tiny leather pouch. She places it on the table without a word. You pick it up. It's no heavier than a swallow. When you loosen the drawstring, you see a tangle of knotted threads, a scrap of parchment inked with a Latin phrase, and what looks suspiciously like a sliver of bone. This is your first lesson in charms against conception. They're part faith, part folklore, and part sheer desperation. You think about how many women clutch these talismans under their skirts. A cord tied around the waist to bind the womb, a pebble held beneath the tongue during intercourse, a prayer whispered 3 times while crossing the threshold of your bedchamber. The line between magic and medicine was as thin as your patience for the local priest's lectures. Some charms claim to work through sympathetic magic, like that bone which she tells you belonged to a small animal that never bred. You try not to laugh, but when you meet her gaze again, you can't. She's watching you with a look that says, don't be so sure. After all, when your life hinges on not conceiving, you'll grasp any thread, no matter how frayed. That's the part modern minds can't quite grasp. You can analyze these practices with all the smug hindsight you want, declare them superstition, nonsense, quaint relics, but here in this candlelit shop, with a century's worth of hushed instructions folded into every shelf, you feel the urgency that once made women knot those charms around their hips. One popular method was the use of spoken charms. You'd recite a phrase in Latin or in the older tongue if you were from the countryside. Some words were lifted straight from Psalms, Others borrowed from pagan incantations, so ancient no one remembered who first spoke them. A mother might whisper it to her daughter, along with a warning never to repeat it aloud where the wrong ears might hear. You trail your finger over a piece of parchment inscribed with a charm meant to close the gate. The ink is faded, but you can still make out the words, Claudatur, utero meo et nullus fetus crescat. Let my womb be closed and no child grow. It's a blunt little plea, but effective enough that the church condemned it as an affront to God's design. The truth is, most of these charms weren't really believed to work alone. They were used alongside herbs, timing, and more practical measures. But even a sliver of faith could soothe you when you lay awake at night, staring at the beams above your bed and wondering if you'd slipped up this time. There's a story you hear often in these little shops about the woman who carried a charm sewn into her hem for 20 years and never conceived, though her neighbors birthed child after child. They said it was proof the charm worked. They said she'd been cursed, or blessed, or something in between. The same story reshaped to fit whatever lesson the teller wanted to impress upon you. You hold the pouch again, feeling the scratch of the knotted thread against your palm. Maybe it's all nonsense, but maybe, in a world where you owned nothing, certainly not your own body, a nonsense charm felt like the only ownership you'd ever taste. If you were caught, you'd face not only scorn but official punishment. Some ecclesiastical courts treated charms as evidence of witchcraft, a suspicion that could spiral from a whispered accusation to a trial before you had time to blink. Yet still, the trade continued. Women slipped coins across counters and tucked their pouches away, telling themselves that a tiny charm might tip the balance when all else failed. You can't help picturing that same woman you saw in the kitchen, her belly rounding, her face pale. Maybe she came here too before her belly showed. Maybe she carried a charm and drank her tea and crossed herself twice, for good measure. Maybe she still ended up praying the child would slip away quietly in the night. The old woman behind the counter clears her throat, jolting you back. She nods toward the door. You've seen enough, she seems to say, or perhaps she knows the questions you can't voice. Questions like, what happens if none of this works? How many charms must fail before you surrender to whatever fate has chosen for you? As you step back out into the night, the wind catches the door and slams it shut behind you. You stand there, the pouch heavy in your pocket. For a moment, you think you hear voices, other women passing by, murmuring to each other about the charms they carry. You remember how many lives have brushed this same threshold, how many secrets have slipped through that narrow doorway, and in that cold hush, you understand that whether or not these charms ever worked, they offered something more precious than certainty, a feeling of control, however fragile, however fleeting, a single knot of thread that said, this is still mine. You keep walking, your shoes scuffing the cobbles, slick with last night's rain. A cat darts across your path, tail high, as if to remind you that here in the tangle of alleys and sanctuaries, every creature fights for survival in its own peculiar way. Ahead, the dark bulk of the monastery rises, its walls thick as a fortress, its bell tower pointing a stone finger toward the sky. You pause under the arch, feeling the weight of centuries pressing down. Inside, you're about to see how the church watched over women's bodies, pretending it was all in the name of piety. You slip through the door, greeted by the low murmur of monks chanting prime. The air smells of candle smoke and cold limestone. A tapestry hangs on the nearest wall, a Madonna cradling an infant, her face serene, her gaze fixed somewhere you'll never see. The message is clear before anyone says a word. Motherhood is sanctified. Fertility is holy. Any woman who dares to meddle with that order is already halfway to sin. But of course, you know that life is never so tidy. Behind this pious facade, there were records, meticulous, ink-stained documents cataloguing midwives, births, and suspected contraceptive practices. The monastery wasn't merely a place of prayer, it was an early bureaucracy, keeping tally of who conceived when and under what circumstances. You trail your fingertips along a shelf stacked with ledgers. In these pages, you can almost hear the voices of scribes reciting names aloud, scratching quills over parchment. One entry records a woman fined for refusing the sacrament after childbirth. Another lists a midwife interrogated for counseling against conception. You feel the quiet cruelty in every line. If you had the nerve, you could ask the prior for a glimpse into the archives. He'd look at you over his spectacles, weighing whether you were some meddlesome pilgrim or a serious scholar, and if he relented, he'd lead you down a spiral stair into the scriptorium, where the chill seeped through your souls. By torchlight, he'd unroll a scroll inked with a single damning phrase, Beneficium contra conceptum, sorcery against conception. The irony is almost comical. The same institution that claimed to guard souls also held the power to crush women who stepped beyond its doctrine. Midwives were the most frequent targets. These were women who knew exactly which herbs eased childbirth, which delayed it, which ended it altogether. They were indispensable until they became too knowledgeable. Then the monastery's silent watch turned on them. You picture a midwife summoned here. She's middle-aged, apron-stained, hands calloused from decades of work. She stands in this same vaulted chamber as a monk recites her alleged crimes. Maybe she did distribute rue and pennyroyal. Maybe she only whispered warnings about too many pregnancies. The truth hardly matters. She has broken the invisible boundary between accepted service and dangerous power. The monk would read aloud the relevant canon law, likely one of the decrees handed down in the 12th century, when the church first codified prohibitions against birth control. You might not know that part, that in 1140, Gratian's decretum made clear that preventing conception was a sin akin to homicide. From that moment, religious authorities claimed the right to monitor even the most intimate corners of a woman's life. Of course, you can't help noticing how uneven this vigilance was. Wealthy noble women often escaped scrutiny. They could pay off inquisitors or have their confessors smooth things over, but for peasant wives and midwives, there was no such protection. If a neighbor grew suspicious or envious, it took little more than a rumor to bring you under ecclesiastical judgment. A monk shuffles past you, his robes brushing the flagstones. For a moment you imagine he's carrying a child in his arms, some infant born to a mother who tried every method to avoid this fate and failed. But no, it's only a bundle of linens. Still, you can't quite shake the vision. You follow him deeper into the cloister, through a colonnade open to the garden. Even here, where mint and sage grow between the paving stones, you can sense the watchfulness, a hush that isn't peace but surveillance. The monks who cultivated these herbs also knew their properties. Some were used to flavor broth, others were whispered about in the kitchens for their more clandestine uses. That's the secret no one says aloud. The monastery didn't just condemn these practices, it relied on them. When noble patrons needed a discreet solution, someone here would arrange it. A fee would be paid, a blessing muttered, a tincture prepared, hypocrisy thick as candle wax. You stand by a worn bench and look across the garden. A pair of novices are pruning the lavender, their faces unreadable. You wonder if they know the stories how many women knelt in the chapel after slipping a sprig of rue into their pockets, praying for forgiveness they didn't truly believe they needed. Even the confessional was no refuge. A woman might confess her use of an herbal infusion to delay pregnancy. The priest would absolve her if she promised never to do it again, but the ledger in the scriptorium recorded her name all the same, tucked away in a quiet list of the wayward. One more woman pinned beneath the church's silent thumb. You step back into the nave, the hush of the sanctuary closing around you. Your eye catches the Virgin's serene face again. Under that calm gaze, countless women were judged, punished, forgiven, and judged again. You walk out into the morning light, feeling the weight lift from your shoulders, but only a little, because now you understand that the monastery wasn't merely a place of faith. It was an engine of control, grinding endlessly, sanctifying obedience while condemning any woman who dared to choose her own path. And as you move away from the walls, you can almost hear the low chant still echoing behind you, solemn, beautiful, and utterly indifferent to the lives it marked in ink. You follow a muddy path away from the monastery, past a row of low cottages crouched together like conspirators. The roofs glisten with last night's rain, and smoke drifts from a dozen hearths. If you didn't know better, you'd think it all looked perfectly ordinary, but you've heard enough whispers to understand that behind some of these doors, a different story is being told, one that ends in flames more often than it ends in forgiveness. You pause at the threshold of a timber-framed house, smaller than the others. A single shutter hangs loose, tapping against the wall. You step inside and find yourself in a cramped room lined with baskets of dried herbs, bundles of feathers, little cloth dolls stuffed with herbs and something darker you'd rather not guess. This is the home of a midwife or a witch, depending on who you ask. The line between those two roles was a thread so thin it could snap with a single accusation. You can picture her now, moving around the smoky room. She's older than you'd expect, grey hair bound in a kerchief, hands broad and strong. She's seen 1,000 births. She knows every corner of the body, every sign that a child will come too soon or not at all, and she knows which plants coax the womb to empty itself when the time comes, knowledge that makes her indispensable until the day it makes her dangerous. When a woman came here seeking help because her belly was rounding and she had no husband, or because her husband was away for a year and she couldn't afford another mouth, she didn't ask if the midwife was a witch. She asked if the remedy would work. That was all that mattered, and if it did, she'd slip away before dawn, wrap her secret tight, and hope the neighbors never learned the truth. Sometimes, though, they did. You've heard the stories. Maybe you've even read them in a town record. Brittle parchment, inked with suspicion. A childless neighbor grows envious. A village priest gets word of a woman who never conceives despite a husband always home. A man blames his wife's barrenness on the old crone who once touched her belly with a scented poultice. In a world where survival hinged on children, the woman who could control conception was a threat too large to tolerate. You run your hand over the bundles dangling from the rafters. Mugwort, betony, motherwort, names that sound almost tender until you remember why they're here. In the corner, a mortar and pestle streaked green. You don't have to look closer to imagine the powder she mixed there. A pinch of rue, a measure of pennyroyal, a little superstition, and a woman's hope that this time the remedy would be enough. Outside, a dog barks, sharp and sudden, and you startle, heart hammering. It's easy to imagine that knock at the door. The bailiff, the priest, the neighbors pressing in. They'd call her a witch before she ever opened her mouth to defend herself. And once that word was spoken, no amount of healing would save her. By the 13th century, the church had begun compiling texts like the Canon Episcopi and later the Malleus Maleficarum, which blurred every line between midwifery and witchcraft. If you knew how to prevent conception or end it, you were an accomplice of the devil. Never mind that your neighbors depended on your skill to survive childbirth. Never mind that you had learned everything from your mother and her mother before her. A single accusation, and your life was over. You picture the midwife standing trial. A hall crowded with solemn-faced men who have never delivered a child, never felt the press of fear in a woman's body. They ask her how she knows which herbs to use. They demand she recite the Lord's Prayer without stumbling. They search her skin for the devil's mark. All while she thinks of the dozens, hundreds of mothers she's helped bring safely through childbirth, the secret lives she's preserved with her knowledge. It's a sick little irony. The very skills that made her respected also made her a target. You can almost hear her voice now, low and steady, as she tries to explain that no devil whispered in her ear, only the memory of her grandmother's lessons and the urgency in the eyes of desperate girls. You step over to the hearth where a copper kettle hangs. The soot is thick, black as regret. You imagine her there on her last night, stirring one final brew while the neighbors gathered their torches. Maybe she knew it was too late. Maybe she hoped some last dose would buy her time. Or maybe she felt nothing at all by then, just a hollow acceptance that no good deed goes unpunished when the world fears a woman's knowledge. You turn away before the image hardens too clearly in your mind. You don't want to see her face in your dreams. As you leave the cottage, you look back once, trying to fix the scene in your memory. The rows of dried plants, the little wooden stool by the fire, the table where she prepared her mixtures. For a moment, you feel something close to gratitude. After all, it was women like her who kept generations alive, sometimes by helping them be born, sometimes by making sure they never were. You pull the door shut behind you, but the thought lingers. In a time when men claimed dominion over every corner of a woman's existence, midwives carried a secret rebellion. They dared to say, "This knowledge is ours, this power is ours," and even when the flames rose to meet them, they held that truth until the very end. The wind catches the loose shutter again. It bangs against the wall, a hollow echo that sounds almost like applause, faint, defiant, impossible to silence. You walk back along the track that winds between fields and orchard plots, the grass wet against your boots. As dawn light bleeds over the horizon, you find yourself thinking about all the marriages tucked behind these hedgerows, unions arranged for land, for alliances, for the dubious promise of peace. Not many were forged purely for love, and in those unions, a woman's womb wasn't just her own burden. It was the property of her husband, her in-laws, and sometimes an entire lineage. You stop beside a low fence and rest your hand on a frost-dusted post. You can almost see them, two newlyweds standing at the threshold of their cottage, the neighbours toasting with watered ale. The young bride's cheeks are bright with nerves. She already knows what's expected. By the next harvest, she must have something to show for the union. Preferably a boy. Ideally two, but whether she conceived or not, that was never fully her choice. Medieval law laid out marriage as both a sacrament and a contract. Canon law declared that consummation was essential. If you refused, you risked annulment or worse, public shame. For men, this was framed as a right. For women, it was an inescapable duty. You'd think that in the hush of a marriage bed, there might be tenderness. Sometimes there was, but just as often, the only consideration was how quickly you could produce an heir. The social contract didn't end there. Once pregnant, a woman lost any remaining say over her own body. Her diet was supervised, her movements restricted, neighbours offered advice she didn't dare refuse. Even her husband's family felt entitled to oversee her care. You might call it community support. She might call it being watched like livestock. You walk past an orchard gate where the branches are bare, brittle twigs clawing the sky. It reminds you of the stories that floated between village hearths, tales of women so worn by repeated pregnancies that their bodies simply gave out. They'd whisper her name, never too loud, in case it sounded like criticism, and agree she'd done her duty. That was the final measure of a wife's worth. There's one record you can't stop thinking about. An English manorial from the late 13th century describing a woman named Alice. Her husband brought her before the manorial court, claiming she refused her marital obligations. She defended herself by saying she'd already borne him 6 children in 9 years, and that her strength was failing. The court ordered her to submit anyway. The logic was simple, his right, her burden. And in case you think only peasants were bound by these expectations, take a stroll in your imagination to a noble hall. The stakes there were even higher. An heiress was a vessel for dynastic ambition. If she failed to conceive, her lands might revert to the crown or pass to a rival branch of the family. Entire wars started because a womb did or didn't produce heirs. The language in marriage contracts made this plain. Some included clauses spelling out due conjugal debt. Others detailed what should happen if a wife failed to bear children after a certain span, often 7 years, though sometimes sooner. The pressure was as relentless as it was invisible. A man's seed was assumed potent by default. If no child came, the woman carried the blame. You picture her lying awake in the dark, counting days, waiting for the first signs of quickening. And when none came, she'd drink infusions of warming herbs, cinnamon, ginger, believing they might rouse her fertility. But if the problem persisted, suspicion could curdle into something uglier, whispers of witchcraft, accusations of infidelity, even the suggestion that she'd committed some secret sin and was being punished by God. Sometimes, ironically, the very same potions used to prevent conception were recommended to stimulate it. The difference was only intent, and whether your husband approved. A midwife might offer mugwort to help you conceive. But if she caught you later buying the same herb to avoid another pregnancy, she might think twice before selling it. You pass a crumbling wall and pause to watch the crows lift from the stones. Their wings flash black against the pale sky. You can't help reflecting how much these women carried, not just the children they bore, but the knowledge that their worth could be measured in infants and the passage of seasons. The good wife was fertile, the better wife was obedient, the best wife was both, and never complained. And yet, even within these confines, women found ways to claim a sliver of power. A wife who'd lost too many pregnancies might feign illness when her husband returned from the fields. Another might rely on timing and caution, counting her cycles, slipping away to a friend's house during fertile days. It wasn't rebellion. Exactly. It was survival. You can imagine the small victories. The night when she successfully dodged her husband's expectations. The quiet relief when another month passed, without the telltale signs. Maybe she confessed to the priest. Maybe she bore the guilt alone. Either way, her life was a balancing act between what she owed to others and what she could endure herself. The morning is brighter now. Frost melts on the grass, leaving dark patches where your footprints mark the way. You think again of Alice in her manorial court, standing straight despite exhaustion, insisting that 6 children were enough. No one listened, but somewhere in her heart, she must have known she was right. You keep walking, feeling the cold lift from your bones, and you understand that these husbands' rights and wives' burdens were never just law. They were the air women breathed, as inescapable as the dawn itself. You leave the orchard road behind, the rutted tracks giving way to a narrow footpath winding through low scrub and bramble. The thorny branches catch your sleeves as if they too would rather you didn't see where this path leads, but you follow it anyway, because you've heard the stories of the lethal cure, and tonight you can't look away. At the end of the path stands a hut so small it could almost be mistaken for a shepherd's shelter. A thin trail of smoke curls from a crooked chimney, carrying the pungent tang of boiled roots, and something sharper, something metallic. You hesitate on the threshold, but then you step inside. The woman who meets your gaze doesn't look like a murderer. She has the calm, lined face of someone who has seen every shape of human desperation. Her hands are stained brown from mixing tinctures. When she gestures to a stool, her voice is gentle, an invitation, not a threat. You sit, and she begins to lay out her wares. Tiny glass bottles, each with a scrap of parchment tied around its neck. You read the labels: Savin, Hellebore, Pennyroyal. You know these names already, but here they come with a new gravity, because in this place, they are more than herbs. They are the last resort. You pick up one of the vials. The liquid inside glints amber, catching the light. She tells you it's an infusion meant to restore menses. You know what that really means? If you were late, if your belly had begun to swell, this was what you drank when you could no longer pretend you had a choice. She doesn't have to explain the risks. Everyone knows someone who took too much and never woke again. In the corner, a basket overflows with dried sprigs of rue. You remember how it smelled in the kitchens, pungent, almost medicinal. But here, the scent carries dread. Women came to this hut when every other avenue had closed, when the priest's forgiveness was too slow, the midwife's potions too weak, the husband's suspicion too sharp. They came because they feared a child more than death itself. You can almost see them sitting on this same stool. Their hands tremble as they accept the vial. Some can't stop weeping, others are so calm it chills you. A young girl, barely past her first bleeding, whose mother sent her here with a coin hidden in her bodice, a widow who would lose her livelihood if her belly gave her away, a wife who couldn't bear another funeral for another baby who wouldn't live past winter, each of them reaching for this final perilous cure. You ask the woman if she believes these remedies are worth the risk. She doesn't answer right away. Instead, she begins to tidy the bottles, her fingers steady as she sorts them by size. When she finally speaks, her voice is soft. "I believe," she says, "that dying on your own terms is sometimes the only power left." Her words stay with you. They echo in the quiet like a bell tolling far away. It's easy centuries later to think of these women as reckless, to wonder why they didn't simply accept their lot. But you can't help imagining yourself in their place. Imagine the fear coiling in your gut when you realized your courses hadn't come. The knowledge that no one would save you, not the law, not the church, not the man who planted this seed. Only this vial stood between you and ruin. You set it down carefully, but your fingertips keep tingling, as if the liquid inside can still touch you across the centuries. In some towns, the penalties for distributing abortifacients were as harsh as those for theft or blasphemy. A woman caught selling them could be fined into poverty or locked in the stocks while the village jeered. Yet this trade never vanished, because no decree, no punishment, no sermon could erase the simple truth. There would always be women too desperate to care what the law said. The woman gestures for you to follow her to a shelf stacked with small clay jars. She lifts the lid of one. Inside, a paste the color of old bone. She tells you this is the strongest remedy she makes. If taken in a small dose, it might bring on bleeding. If taken in too great a quantity, it stops the heart. You wonder how many times she has tried to explain this to trembling customers. How many times she has seen them take it anyway. You ask her how she bears it. She looks at you, her eyes as steady as her hands. "I don't," she says. "I just do what must be done." There's no heroism in her tone, no pride, just a weary certainty you can't quite name. You step outside again, the cold morning air shocking in its clarity. You stand there for a long moment trying to shake the image of the hut, the bottles, the women who came here to claim one last scrap of control over their lives. You realize there are no clean answers in this history, only the same old choices, risk or surrender, life or survival, shame or death. And you understand, perhaps for the first time, why these lethal cures endured. Not because women were reckless, but because the world gave them no gentler escape. As you turn away, the hut shrinks behind you until it's no more than a smudge against the hedge. You keep walking, and though the road winds on, you know you will carry the memory of that place, of her steady hands and her quiet sorrow, long after the path has vanished. You follow a rutted road that dips into a shallow valley where the church spire stands. Watch over clustered cottages. The air is still here, almost reverent, and the path to the chapel door is worn smooth by cairns of pilgrim feet. You draw your cloak tighter and step onto the threshold, where the smell of candle wax mingles with cold stone and something softer, dried flowers laid before the saints. You pause by the first shrine, your gaze rising to the painted face of a woman crowned in gold. She holds an infant against her breast, her eyes cast downward in gentle sorrow. This is Saint Margaret, patron of childbirth. Her legend says she burst forth alive from the belly of a dragon, a tidy metaphor, you think, for surviving something designed to consume you. You move down the line of chapels, each niche holding a different promise. Here, Saint Anne, protector of mothers; there, Saint Bridget, who eased the pains of labour; and there, hidden behind the choir screen, the most quietly visited of all, Saint Catherine of Alexandria, invoked by women who prayed for their wombs to remain empty. If you look closely, You see the little offerings left on the altar, ribbons, candles, a scrap of linen embroidered with initials. Each token is a confession no priest would ever hear aloud, a woman's secret hope for freedom, disguised as piety. You kneel for a moment, your knees pressing into the cold stone. You don't have to believe to understand the desperation that brought women here. When you've tried every herb, every charm, every whispered remedy, sometimes all that remains is to beg the intercession of a saint. You imagine a girl not much older than 15, her belly already swelling, her gaze fixed on the painted face of Margaret. Maybe she murmurs a plea to survive childbirth. Or maybe, in the hush between prayers, she dares to whisper that she doesn't want the child at all. She hopes Margaret will hear her anyway. It wasn't only fear of dying in labour that brought them here. Sometimes it was the fear of living, of being bound forever to a man who hurt them, or condemned to grinding poverty with another mouth to feed. You can almost hear their voices in the dark. Saint Anne, spare me. Saint Bridget, let my womb rest. Saint Catherine, let this pass like a shadow. Their prayers weren't always so solemn. Some had the weary humour born of hard lives. A woman lighting a votive might joke that she needed a saint's help because her husband certainly wouldn't restrain himself. Another might murmur that even the Virgin must understand her plight. She too was once an unwed mother after all. A small defiant joke to soften the ache of shame. You step deeper into the chapel, where coloured glass filters the morning into jewelled stripes across the floor. The air is warmer here, close and perfumed with beeswax. A single candle flickers at the foot of St. Margaret's statue. You wonder who lit it. It's maybe a mother who has survived childbirth too many times. Maybe a widow who cannot bear the thought of starting again. Maybe a young bride who lies awake counting days, dreading the quickening she knows will come. You remember how the church alternated between condemning and comforting these women. A priest might preach that refusing motherhood was a sin, that their wombs were given to them by God for his purpose. But the same priest might also bless the candle they carried to St. Margaret's feet. The contradiction never seemed to trouble anyone, least of all the men who wrote the rules. It's easy to be cynical, standing here centuries later, to see the saints as symbols of a system that bound women to endless labour and called it virtue. But if you listen carefully, if you let your mind quiet, you can hear something else beneath the pious chants. You can hear 1,000 whispered hopes, layered one over the other, until they become a single low murmur. Let me be spared. You walk back toward the door, your footsteps echoing off the vaults. A breeze slips through a crack in the stone and lifts the candle flame. For an instant it dances brighter, and you feel something close to pity for all those who believed that intercession was their only protection. At the threshold, you look back one last time. The saints watch you with the same calm, painted eyes they've worn for 600 years. Maybe they listened, maybe they didn't. But for the women who knelt here, it was worth the chance. You step into the morning light, blinking at the sudden brightness. The door creaks shut behind you, sealing the hush inside, and you carry the memory of those candles with you, a soft glow that persists even in daylight, a reminder that when every worldly recourse was exhausted, there was still a final hope flickering in the dark. You lean against a worn pillar and watch a young woman hurry by, her scarf pulled low to hide her face. You recognize the way she keeps her gaze fixed on the ground. She's afraid, not of the church or the midwife's remedies, but of the shame that came with barrenness. You follow her, a silent observer, as she slips around the corner into a small timbered house. Inside, the air is heavy with the scent of boiled cabbage and wood smoke. An older woman sits by the hearth, hands folded over her apron. When the girl enters, she lifts her chin, searching her face for signs of pregnancy, of guilt, of failure. You know without asking that this is her mother-in-law, and you know how the conversation will go. A dozen variations of the same question. Any sign? Any hope? Any news? It's easy to forget that not every woman who sought to control her fertility was trying to avoid pregnancy. Some were desperate for it. desperate enough to drink concoctions that promise to open the womb, even if they tasted of copper and rot. You've heard the old prescriptions: a poultice of rose petals and honey, a draught of wine steeped with anise, a charm whispered over a cup of milk before dawn. None of it guaranteed, all of it offered with the same quiet hope. In the corner of the room, a small carved crucifix watches over them. You wonder how many times this girl has prayed for a child, how many nights she's lain awake, imagining a tiny heartbeat beneath her hand, and how many mornings she's woken to the same emptiness. You turn away and step back into the street, feeling the hush that follows you. You think about how often a woman's worth was pinned to her fertility, how every glance and every careless question could pierce deeper than any blade. One chronicle from a Yorkshire manor records the story of a woman named Mabel who was put aside after 10 childless years. Her husband claimed she had been cursed or had cursed herself. The neighbours nodded along, content to let the blame settle on her shoulders, never mind that he was nearly 60 or that no one had ever seen evidence of her supposed sins. In the ledger, her name appears once, beside a terse note, set aside for barrenness. As if that were all she ever was. You walk on, past a row of workshops where blacksmiths hammer iron into ploughshares. The noise rings in your ears, a reminder that life never paused for a woman's grief. If you failed to conceive, you were expected to accept it with grace, to keep the household running, to endure the small humiliations that came with being less than what your marriage required. But there were those who refused to surrender. You've read the letters, women petitioning bishops and lords to intervene, to compel their husbands to honour their vows despite childlessness. You can almost hear their voices in the brittle parchment. I have done all that is expected of me. I have prayed. I have fasted. Still the Lord has not seen fit to bless me, but I am no less a wife. You reach the edge of the village, where the fields open out in a wide hush of green. A lone figure walks the furrows, stooping to gather herbs. You recognize her from the stories, the woman who knows every root and leaf that might coax a womb to quicken. She's neither saint nor witch, just a thread in the same tapestry of hope and shame. As she straightens and catches your eye, you feel that same old ache, the understanding that for all their knowledge, these women could never guarantee anything. The line between success and failure was as thin as a blade of grass, and just as easily broken. You step onto the path again, the morning wind lifting your hair, and you carry with you the memory of that young woman in the cottage, her hands pressed to her empty belly. A reminder that in medieval life, the shame of barrenness could be as heavy as the fear of too many births, and that no matter which side of the line you found yourself on, you were never free. You follow a cart track skirting the edge of a manor's outer wall, the stones thick with moss and lichen. Here, everything looks tidy, fields combed into neat rows, hedgerows trimmed. The great house rising above it all with smug authority, but you already know what you'll find if you step through the archway. The same tangled fears and silent bargains that haunted every woman's life, only gilded over with heraldry and silver. When you pass beneath the carved crest, you imagine the noble families who paced this courtyard, their footsteps muffled by rushes. If a peasant woman's fertility determined her survival, a noble woman's shaped the fate of kingdoms. One heir too few could fracture an alliance, trigger a war, or end a dynasty altogether. You picture her now, a lady in a gown stiff with embroidery, standing by a tall window. She's barely 20, her belly already rounding. She has no illusions about why she was wed. Her family's land, her womb, her dowry, all were bartered in the same transaction. For noble women, conception wasn't simply a personal matter, it was public business. There were witnesses to the wedding bed, midwives to verify births, clerics to record the date of conception. When the child came, it wasn't truly hers. It belonged to the lineage, to the name etched into the escutcheon, over the hearth. If the child was male, her value increased overnight. If female or stillborn, she might find herself whispered about in the solar or eyed with suspicion across the high table. You can almost hear the murmurs. Perhaps she is barren. Perhaps she offended God. Perhaps her blood is thin. And if she failed to produce any child at all, well, there were remedies for that. You recall the records of annulments granted on grounds of infertility, the Latin phrases that reduced a woman's life to a legal defect. Impotentia coendi, if it was blamed on the husband, rarely invoked. Frigiditas molebri, if the wife's body was deemed cold. Always the woman's fault first. You step into a chamber hung with tapestries depicting genealogies, branches sprouting from crowned figures, children clustered like ripe fruit. These images weren't merely decoration, they were declarations, proof that the family's future was secured by a woman's body. Fail to bear fruit, and you became a liability. You stand at the edge of the nursery, where a carved cradle sits beneath a window. The linen is fresh, lavender tucked beneath the pillow. You try not to think about the infants who never lay there long, about the stillborn wrapped in winding cloth before the dawn bell rang, about the wet nurse summoned when a noble woman was too weak or too indifferent to nurse her own child. If the lady of the house was fortunate, she might have a private midwife, a physician trained in university medicine, but even so, no tincture or amulet could guarantee a living heir. You remember the chronicles of royal courts, queens who miscarried again and again, their grief transformed into political crisis, kings who raged and accused, courts that speculated whether witchcraft or sin had dried up the queen's womb. You touch the cradle, feeling the smooth curve of its wood. You think about Eleanor of Aquitaine, who bore 10 children, and whose fertility was counted among her greatest achievements, or Isabella of France, who endured scorn when she produced only one son. Even power couldn't shield them from scrutiny. You can't help wondering how many noble women tried to hedge their odds, sneaking remedies into their wine, bribing the midwife to brew something stronger, kneeling in private chapels to whisper desperate bargains to God, and how many others accepted their fate standing silent while the councillors drafted the documents that would declare their marriages invalid. Outside, the manor bell tolls terse. Servants hurry across the yard with baskets of linen. You step back from the nursery doorway and follow the corridor toward the solar. In the hush of that high-ceilinged room, you see the lady again, sitting by the fire. She's embroidering a layette, her face composed, her hands steady, but her thoughts are elsewhere, counting days, wondering if her courses will come, if the sickness in her belly will quicken into life or fade. She will smile when her husband enters. She will accept the priest's blessing. She will pretend she isn't afraid. But in the quiet hours before dawn, she will lay her palm over her stomach and pray that this time the child will be strong, that this time her body will not betray her. You leave the manor behind, stepping out into the pale sun. The fields look no different from those you passed earlier, only the stakes were higher. Here a woman's fertility wasn't just her burden, it was the fulcrum of inheritance, alliance, and survival. And if she failed, the price was more than personal, it was dynastic. As you walk on, the manor shrinks behind you, but you carry its hush inside you, the knowledge that even in the highest halls, the woman's womb was never hers alone. It was the property of every ambition that claimed her. You leave the manor's trimmed hedgerows behind, your boots sinking into softer earth as you follow a winding lane that descends toward the river. The water slides past, brown and cold, carrying twigs and scraps of leaf. It looks so innocent, drifting along under the morning sky. But you know better, because this river has witnessed countless secrets, some washed away, some pulled back into the light by the wrong pair of hands. You cross a narrow bridge, feeling the boards flex beneath your weight. On the far bank, a cluster of low buildings leans against each other like gossiping neighbors. One of them bears the carved sign of a midwife, a woman holding a child in her arms. But everyone in the village knows that she did more than deliver babies. She was the last stop for women whose pregnancies were not supposed to be. You stand outside the doorway, imagining the footsteps that passed over this threshold. Some arrived under cover of night, cloaks pulled tight around their bellies. Others came in daylight, faces blank with the pretense of ordinary errands. All of them carried the same gnawing fear that if anyone discovered what they planned to do, they'd be punished not just by their neighbors, but by the law itself. You slip inside, where the air is dense with the scent of fennel and stale rushes. A stool stands beside the hearth, worn smooth by 100 desperate visits. You can almost see the girl who once sat here, her hands clutched over her belly, her lips moving in a prayer she doesn't quite believe will be heard. She's risking everything, because in this century, the punishments for secret abortions are as unforgiving as the cold stone under your feet. You recall the assizes rolls and ecclesiastical court records. Women accused of ending pregnancies faced fines that could ruin a household. In more severe cases, they were excommunicated, cut off from the sacraments, condemned to live as moral exiles, and if death followed, if the mixture proved too strong, then the midwife might be charged with homicide. Sometimes the punishment was a matter of public spectacle, stocks in the square, a penance garment that marked you as a sinner, a fine so steep your children would grow up hungry, and always the same murmured judgment. She tried to unmake what God had willed. You look around the room and feel how impossible it must have seemed to make any other choice, because for many women, the alternative was worse. The loss of a place in the household, the certainty of starvation if a husband cast them out, the quiet knowledge that no one would offer charity to a mother with too many mouths to feed. The fire snaps in the hearth, and you imagine the midwife stooping over it, stirring her brew with practiced hands. Her face is lined, but her gaze is clear. She knows exactly what she risks every time she helps a woman end a pregnancy. But she also knows what will happen if she refuses. A girl will drink lie or try to bleed herself. A wife will vanish into the woods with a rope. A servant will throw herself into the river before the shame can catch her. This is why she does it. Not because she relishes the danger, but because she's seen what happens when no one is willing to help. You trail your hand across a shelf of jars, each labelled in a careful hand: calamus, juniper, savin. Some are innocuous, used for fevers or coughs. Others are known by every woman in the county for their more dangerous purpose. You pick up a small clay pot and feel the weight of it in your palm. A few spoonfuls could change a life, or end it. You remember the 13th century canon law that defined abortion as homicide if the fetus was formed, a phrase so vague it gave priests and magistrates wide discretion to judge. You think about the women who must have stood before the bench, shivering in their thin gowns, hearing their fate decided by men who would never know what it felt like to be trapped in a body turned traitor. A log shifts in the fire, sending up a brief flare of light. For a moment, the whole room brightens, and you glimpse the outlines of all the women who have passed through here. Some survived, some didn't. All of them were judged. You step back outside, the door closing behind you with a dull thud. The river murmurs beside you, carrying away the last traces of that hidden world. You pause on the bridge, feeling the boards quiver under your heels, and look down into the water. You can almost see the reflection of a woman kneeling at the bank, hands cupped as if she could rinse away her guilt, but nothing in that river has ever washed clean. As you walk on, the village shrinks behind you. The stories of its women remain, woven into the hush of dawn, the scent of fennel, the worn plank by the hearth. You understand that punishment for abortion wasn't merely a matter of law. It was a sentence pronounced by every neighbor who thought herself righteous, by every priest who refused absolution, by every husband who turned his back. And the only mercy ever offered was the silence that fell after the door closed, a silence more merciful than any judgment. You leave the river behind and follow a path that threads between hedgerows alive with the chatter of sparrows. Morning has turned fully to day, the sky rinsed pale and cloudless, but you feel no warmth as you walk. Your mind keeps turning over the same question. If the punishments were so harsh, how did the trade survive? You don't have to search far for the answer, because just beyond the next bend, a low cluster of stalls huddles beneath patched awnings. The place looks innocent enough, a market for dried beans, onions, homespun cloth, but if you linger long enough, You'll see the real business unfolding in hushed exchanges and careful gestures. This is the cunning women's market. You stand at the edge and watch for a while. It's a choreography so subtle you might miss it. A woman trading a sprig of rue for a few coins, a folded scrap of instructions slipped into a palm. No raised voices, no outward sign of scandal, only the quiet commerce of desperation. You wander past the first stall, where a grey-haired seller offers bundles of dried herbs. Most are ordinary: thyme, sage, lavender, but tucked at the back are things less likely to season a pot. Pennyroyal for starters, tied in neat sheaves and labelled simply as for the household, a knowing euphemism if ever there was one. A woman in a patched green gown steps up to buy a bundle. You see the tremor in her fingers as she counts out her coins. The seller doesn't ask questions. She wraps the herbs in brown paper, ties them with twine, and places them in the buyer's hands, with a nod that says, "We don't need to speak of this. This market thrives not because everyone is ignorant of the risks, but because they know them all too well and still choose to gamble." When you live in a world where childbirth can kill you, or a single pregnancy can push your family into ruin, the dose of pennyroyal can feel like the only sane choice. You step into the shade of a canvas awning and study the baskets heaped with more remedies: juniper berries, tansy leaves, mugwort. Each has its reputation whispered from mother to daughter in kitchens and fields. You think again of the midwives who once sold these same herbs openly, until a charge of witchcraft or homicide silenced them. Now the knowledge is fragmented, traded in secret, never written down. A tall woman in a blue shawl stands beside you, her gaze fixed on a jar of thick, resinous paste. When the seller leans close, she murmurs something you can't quite catch. A moment later, the seller vanishes into the back of the stall and returns with a smaller pot. She holds it out carefully, and you feel the hush deepen around them. Whatever she's selling now isn't meant for fevers or headaches. You wonder how many lives begin and end in exchanges like this. Coins pressed into a palm, a promise mumbled, a packet hidden beneath a bodice. In this place, no one asks for names. No one dare. At the far end of the row, a girl no older than 16 fidgets beside a stack of baskets. She tries to look as if she's only waiting for a friend, but her eyes keep darting to the herb stall. When the crowd thins, she steps forward. The seller doesn't blink, just reaches for a bundle already prepared. It's clear they've done this before. You watch her take the parcel, tuck it inside her sleeve, and walk away without meeting anyone's gaze. Her face is set, but you glimpse the fear beneath. It's the same fear that has driven countless women to these markets, the terror of what will happen if they do nothing. You step into the sunlight, blinking. Around you, the rest of the market hums along, potatoes weighed, eggs traded, gossip drifting between stalls. You're struck by the contrast. Ordinary commerce alongside the secret barter for control over life itself. It would be easier to judge this trade if you'd never known the stakes. If you'd never heard a woman whisper that she'd rather risk her own life than face another hungry winter with another child she couldn't feed. If you'd never seen how many marriages cracked under the strain of too many mouths and too little bread. You turn back one last time, letting your eyes skim the stalls. You see not only the cunning women, but the women who come to them, wives, widows, daughters, each carrying her own private calculus of risk. Some will leave with hope, some will leave with poison, all will leave with the knowledge that this is the only freedom they'll ever be allowed. And in the hush between footsteps, you can almost hear the old refrain that passed between them. Better this risk than no choice at all. You walk on, the market fading behind you, replaced by the low murmur of bees in the hedgerow, but you carry its lessons with you, as heavy as the bundles tucked beneath those women's shawls, a reminder that even in a world determined to control them, women found ways to reclaim a sliver of power, however fleeting, however dangerous. You leave the market's drifting voices behind and take a narrow footpath that cuts between fields. It feels good to let your feet find their rhythm in the quiet. No clink of coins, no careful bartering, Only the steady hush of wind through stubble and the dull ache of questions that refuse to leave you. How did they understand conception? What did they think was happening inside their own bodies? Because you see, in this time, even the scholars who claimed to know the most were groping in a fog of half-truths and guesses, and yet their theories ruled every woman's life. You crest a small rise where an orchard leans against the sky, the branches dark and bare. You stand there a moment, remembering what you've read in old manuscripts, how medieval alchemy, medicine and faith all tangled together to create a patchwork of belief about fertility. Some said conception was a matter of humors, 4 liquids in the body whose balance determined whether you could bear children. If your womb was too cold or your blood too thin, no seed could take hold. Others insisted it was celestial, stars and planets charted the moment a life began. The best you could do was schedule your union to please the heavens. You walk into the orchard, boots crackling over fallen twigs, and picture a woman pressing her palm to her belly. She doesn't have any microscope or anatomy text to guide her. All she has are these stories that a child grows from the mingling of seeds, or from the quickening of the soul breathed into flesh. That a sudden fright or too much melancholy could kill a pregnancy before it ever showed. It sounds quaint now, doesn't it? But back then, these theories shaped everything. Doctors trained at Salerno or Montpellier swore by treatises that declared a woman's seed inferior, colder, weaker, destined to be shaped by the heat of the man's contribution. Others insisted both seeds were equal, but the moon's position at conception decided the child's sex. You can almost hear the lectures in smoky halls, scholars waving their wax tablets like scepters of truth. Yet for all their certainty, most remedies still fell back on the same principles. Warm the womb if it was cold, cool it if it was too hot, soothe it if it was distressed. You imagine the confusion for the woman trying to interpret her own body, a missed cycle blamed on the wrong alignment of Mars or an excess of phlegm. You pass under a gnarled pear tree and see a woman kneeling collecting windfalls into her apron. She doesn't look up as you walk by. Maybe she's thinking about the same questions. Am I barren? Am I cursed? Am I merely unlucky? It didn't help that learned men often contradicted themselves. In 1 century, Aristotle's writings were the gold standard, declaring the man's seed the true engine of life. In the next, Galen's models regained favour, treating the woman's seed as equal but unstable, and all the while, midwives held a more practical knowledge, based on observation rather than theory. They knew that a woman's monthly cycle mattered, that timing mattered, that sometimes nothing worked, and no one knew why. You picture them sitting by the hearth with expectant mothers, listening patiently, offering counsel laced with herbs and hope. Then you picture the same women standing before a magistrate, their knowledge recast as witchcraft because it didn't fit the tidy frameworks of male scholarship. You wonder if any of them ever laughed at the doctor's elaborate theories, if they ever tucked a sprig of mugwort into a pouch and thought, we may not know why it works, but it does. You walk past the orchard's edge where a row of beehives hums in the sun. Even here, you can't escape the old metaphors. Bees were symbols of industrious fertility, tiny proof that life could be orchestrated with the right care. More than one medieval text compared the womb to a hive, warm, orderly, productive, and if it failed to produce, it must be the woman's fault. You crouch to watch a single bee crawl along the comb, its body dusted with pollen. You think about all the women who carried these comparisons like a yoke. A good womb was obedient, fruitful, always ready to be filled. Anything less was suspect. As you stand and walk on, the wind picks up, shaking the bare branches. You wonder how many women ever questioned these certainties, how many lay awake at night feeling their own bodies turning into strangers, trying to divine what they had done wrong, because that was the cruelest truth of all. The alchemy of conception remained a mystery, and in the absence of real knowledge, 1,000 superstitions bloomed, each one another way to blame the woman. When you finally reach the far edge of the orchard, the path opens onto a low hill overlooking the fields. You stand there a moment, letting the wind flatten your cloak against your ribs. And you think about all the theories that once passed for wisdom, and you feel something that isn't quite scorn, something closer to sorrow, because even the most learned men couldn't answer the questions every woman carried in her heart. Why me? Why not me? And how much of this fate is truly mine? You leave the orchard behind and follow the path down the hill until the grass gives way to packed earth, scored with wagon ruts. Ahead, the roofs of a hamlet huddle together against the wind. You walk toward the nearest cottage, its shutters latch tight, and you already know what you'll find inside. A woman in childbed, gripping the edge of life with both hands. The door creaks open under your palm, and you step into a dim room that smells of tallow smoke and something sharper, sweat, fear, blood. A midwife kneels at the foot of a straw mattress. The woman lying there is no more than 20, her hair pasted to her temples, her eyes fixed on a beam overhead as if she can outstare the pain. You edge closer. Even from here, you see how pale she is. In another time, you might call this moment a miracle, life about to be born. But here in this small, cold cottage, it's a gamble as deadly as any plague. Childbirth has always been dangerous, but in this century, it's a ritual of survival. No antiseptics, no anesthesia, only faith, skill and luck. You watch the midwife check her pulse, murmuring a prayer that mingles Latin with old folk phrases. No one cares whether the words come from the church or the hedgerow, so long as they work. The girl's mother hovers nearby, clutching a scrap of cloth. You can almost feel her helplessness, the memory of her own labors rising like a ghost. She knows what's at stake. Everyone does, because if the bleeding can't be stopped, there will be nothing left but the priest's last rites and a hasty burial before the sun sets. You glance around the room, a candle guttering on the sill, a basin half full of cloudy water, a small cradle waiting, its emptiness almost cruel. The midwife reaches for a jar of goose fat to ease the delivery. She moves quickly, efficiently. She's done this 100 times. She knows the signs: when to wait, when to act, when to send a girl running for the parish priest. A contraction seizes the girl's body, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The midwife's voice is steady as she instructs her to push. Outside, the wind rattles the shutters. You try to imagine what the girl is thinking, whether she believes she will see the dawn. If she survives, she will be praised for her endurance. If she doesn't, the priest will remind her family that this is the lot of women since Eve's first trespass. The knowledge settles over you like cold ash. Here, motherhood isn't simply expected, it is demanded at any cost. You think about how many times this story has played out. A wife expected to conceive again and again, no matter how frail she becomes. A girl barely out of childhood pressed into marriage and pregnancy before her hips have widened enough to bear it safely. A widow remarried to secure property, her body enlisted once more in the cause of lineage. You've read the records, parish registers filled with the names of women dead in childbed. No ceremony, no tribute, just a single line noting the day she slipped out of the world. One chronicle from Norfolk lists 4 sisters, each lost before their 25th year, each buried in the same churchyard. No one questioned why. It was simply what happened. You stand beside the bed, the air thick with the smell of iron and damp linen. Another contraction comes. This time the midwife's voice sharpens. You see the urgency in her eyes. She gestures for the mother to help brace the girl's shoulders. You can almost feel the moment teetering, life balanced on the edge of something final. Minutes pass. Then, with a wet, shuddering cry, the child emerges, slick and limp. The midwife moves fast, clearing the mouth and nose, rubbing the tiny chest with a scrap of cloth. You hold your breath until you hear the first thin wail. Relief rushes through the room like clean air. But when you look at the mother, you see her face contorting in a new agony. The midwife presses a hand to her belly, feeling for the afterbirth. Blood pools on the sheets. Too much. Far too much. This is the part no one writes about in the miracle stories. the part where the bleeding can't be stopped, the part where all the whispered prayers, all the learned treatises, all the careful midwifery fail. You watch as the midwife works, binding the belly with linen strips, urging the mother to drink a tincture meant to staunch the flow. But you know what's coming. Everyone here does. A hush settles over the room as the girl's breath grows shallow. The cradle waits by the hearth, a promise the mother will never keep. You can almost hear the quiet weeping that will fill this cottage when the midwife finally steps back and bows her head. And you understand in your bones why so many women risked everything to avoid this day, why they drank the bitter teas, tied charms around their waists, prayed to saints to keep their wombs empty, because every pregnancy was a loaded die, and no one could be sure which side would fall. When you step back outside, the sky is the same pale blue. The sparrows still sing in the hedgerow, but you feel as if the world should pause, just for a moment, to acknowledge the price that was paid in that small, smoky room. And as you walk away, you carry her memory with you, a reminder that in medieval life, to be a mother was to stand unflinching before the possibility of death. You walk on, leaving the hush of that cottage behind you, but the memory of it lingers, like a chill in your bones you can't shake. The path widens as it skirts a field gone fallow, and ahead you glimpse the shape of a larger house, a manor, but not so grand as the one you passed earlier. Its walls are pale stone, and you can already sense the lives it shelters. Not lords, but the middling sort, landed farmers, minor gentry, people who hover just above poverty, just below power. You pause at the threshold, imagining the hush inside. You think you know what you'll find, and you're right. In the long hall where rushes crackle underfoot, a wet nurse rocks a bundled infant, her head bent as she hums a lullaby. You step closer, drawn by the quiet ache in that simple scene. The baby stirs in her arms, rooting blindly toward her breast. You notice the slight tremor in her hand as she guides him to feed. This isn't her child, but you can see how her body responds anyway, milk rising with the same inexorable urgency as if you were her own. Wet nursing was more common than you might think. Among the nobility, it was almost expected. A lady's body was considered too delicate or too valuable to waste on nursing. Even among prosperous farmers, a mother might be encouraged to wean early so she could conceive again quickly. The sooner she was fertile, the sooner she could secure another heir. You stand beside the settle and remember the records you've read, accounts of noble households where infants were handed to a wet nurse within hours of birth. Sometimes the nurse moved into the family home. Sometimes the baby was sent away to a village cottage. Either way, the mother's role was reduced to letters of inquiry and the occasional visit to see how the child was thriving. You wonder how many of those mothers wept in secret when their arms felt too light, and how many told themselves it was a kindness to keep their bodies free for the next child. But not every woman who relinquished her baby did so willingly. For poorer mothers, fostering arrangements were often born of necessity rather than choice. You've read parish accounts noting how infants were set out to nurse when a mother died in childbirth, or when hunger loomed too close. Sometimes the arrangement saved a life, sometimes it merely prolonged a slow decline. You turn your attention to the nurse, studying the weariness etched in her face. She's given birth herself, perhaps many times, and now her milk keeps another woman's child alive. In a ledger somewhere, there will be a notation recording her fee, the date she entered service, but there is no entry for this moment. The soft hush of her voice, the child's small sigh as he suckles, a creak sounds from the doorway. You look up to see a young woman standing there, hands clasped at her waist. You recognize her from the line of her shoulders. This is the mother. Her expression is carefully composed, but her gaze doesn't quite meet the nurse's. She stands there for a long moment, as if debating whether to step closer. Then, slowly, she does. She rests her palm on the infant's cheek, her thumb brushing the downy skin. Her mouth moves, some blessing, some apology, but no sound emerges, and you can feel the tension between them, as taut as spun flax, gratitude and envy, relief and shame. Because in this world, a woman's body could be at once too precious and too expendable, too necessary to risk in childbirth, yet never fully her own, too vital for lineage, yet expected to be handed over at a moment's notice. You think about how many women labored in fields or manor kitchens with the ache of milk in their breasts, while another woman's child fed on their bodies. How many mothers lay awake wondering whether their infants remembered them at all. Outside, a rooster crows. The wet nurse lifts her gaze, meets the mother's eyes, and for a single heartbeat, something unspoken passes between them. Not quite understanding, not quite forgiveness, only the fragile acknowledgement that both of them are caught in the same net. You step back from the settle, your footsteps muffled by the rushes. At the doorway you look once more at the child, sated and drowsy, unaware of the bargains that determined his first nourishment. As you leave the house, the air feels clearer somehow, as if you've crossed back into your own time. But you can't help thinking about all the women whose milk sustained other families, other ambitions, other futures, and you understand why some mothers clung fiercely to their babies, refusing to surrender even when everyone insisted it was for the best. Because in a life where so much was out of their control, the simple act of feeding a child was the last claim they could lay upon their own bodies. You leave the manor behind, your path winding through fields where the barley rustles in the breeze, like whispers you can't quite catch. Each footstep feels heavier now, as if the stories you've gathered are pressed into your bones. You pass the edge of the village, where a squat stone church rises from the grass like a final word. Its doors are propped open. You step inside and find yourself in a hush so complete it seems to press against your skin. Candles flicker along the nave, casting soft halos on the worn wooden pews, and in a corner darkened by centuries of breath and candle soot, you see the confessional. You walk toward it, your heart drumming. You can almost picture the women who stood here before you, waiting their turn. They'd clutch their shawls close and look at the floor, praying no neighbor would recognize them, no gossip would slip out with the smoke. For all the secret remedies and folk practices, confession was the place where many women finally laid down their burdens, or tried to, because the church claimed dominion over not only their souls, but their bodies too. If you drunk a draught to end a pregnancy or tied a charm to prevent one, this was the box where you were supposed to confess it. You picture a young woman stepping into the gloom, her knees pressing into the cold flagstones. As she lowers her head, the wooden screen slides aside with a groan. On the other side, a priest's silhouette, blurred by the lattice. She begins to speak. Her voice is so low you have to lean in to catch it. She names the herbs she took: pennyroyal, mugwort. She admits the months when she timed her unions carefully, the days she fled to a neighbor's hearth to avoid her husband. Each word falls into the dark like a stone into a well, and you can almost hear the priest's questions, the same ones repeated for generations. Did you act alone? Did you know it was a mortal sin? Do you repent? Sometimes the penance was light fasting, alms, prayers recited until the tongue went numb, but other times the punishment was harsher. Public confession, penance robes, a warning that excommunication waited if she dared repeat her crime. You can almost feel her shoulders shaking under the weight of it. Because in this moment, she is both penitent and condemned. The same church that offered absolution never let her forget that her body was not hers to govern, that even her most private decisions must be accounted for. You step back, your hand grazing the smooth curve of the confessional's door. You think about the priests who listened, some stern, some weary, some perhaps a little gentler than their office allowed. You think of the women who returned week after week, convinced that their guilt was an unending ledger. One chronicle you've read tells of a woman named Juliana, who confessed the same sin 4 times in 1 year. Each time she wept, swore she would never again try to prevent a pregnancy. Each time she failed, and each time the priest recorded her name in the parish book, a tally of contrition that never quite erased itself. Outside, a bell begins to toll the hour. The sound is rich and hollow, as if the very stones are lamenting. You watch the flickering candles and imagine the hundreds of women whose prayers hung in this air, pleas for mercy, forgiveness, strength. Some believed absolution would bring peace, others only wanted to survive the next season. You look toward the altar where a carved virgin gazes down, her face serene. She is crowned in lilies, the symbol of perfect chastity. But you wonder if any woman ever looked up and thought, "You never had to confess this, did you? You never had to kneel here and admit you were only trying to stay alive." The thought feels blasphemous, but you let it linger, because it's true. These women were judged by standards no saint ever had to meet. You turn and walk back into the light, the threshold cool under your hand. As the door swings shut behind you, you feel the weight of all those confessions pressing at your back. And you understand that for many women, the greatest sorrow wasn't the sin itself, but the knowledge that even in the most private corners, there was no true sanctuary, only another ledger, another witness, another reckoning. You leave the church behind, its bells still echoing in your chest, and follow the lane out of the village. Here, the road softens to grass, the hedgerows rising high on either side, shutting out the world. You welcome the quiet after all the voices, all the candles guttering in dark corners. You need space to let the stories settle. You crest a low rise where the land unfurls toward the horizon. Fields, cottages, orchards, all stitched together by the same relentless pattern. Birth, judgment, punishment, repetition. The wind tastes of rain, and you stand there for a while, breathing it in, wondering how many women had paused on this same ridge, trying to glimpse some sign that their lives would ever belong to them. You walk on, your feet tracing a cart track that bends past an old stone cross half buried in nettles. It bears no inscription, only the rough outline of arms and the suggestion of a face long worn away. You've heard that these wayside crosses once marked parish boundaries, places where travellers paused to pray or to swear oaths. But you suspect they also marked the edges of stories where a woman's private struggle ended, and the world's judgment began. You think of them now, all the women whose lives you've touched tonight, the girl who sipped pennyroyal in the hush of a smoky kitchen, the midwife who risked everything to help her, the lady of the manor, her worth measured in heirs she could produce, the wet nurse cradling a stranger's child, the mother who never rose from the childbed, the girl who knelt in the confessional, her whispered confession already written into the ledgers she could never erase. It would be comforting to believe that these stories were only the past, that their struggles faded when the church door swung shut behind them, but you know better. You know that somewhere, even now, women measure their lives in the same quiet reckonings, still forced to barter their safety, their dignity, sometimes their very breath for the right to decide what happens within the borders of their own flesh. You turn onto a narrower path, bordered by hawthorn. The white blossoms have begun to fall, drifting in small, slow spirals. They look almost like blessings. Almost. And you can't help wondering, how many of those women ever glimpsed a moment of peace? A morning when they didn't wait counting days or weighing risks. A night when their dreams were not stalked by fear or shame. If you listen closely, you can almost hear their voices carried on the wind, 1,000 private truths that no priest or magistrate could fully silence. 1,000 small rebellions that slip through the cracks of doctrine and law. As you reach the end of the path, the hedgerows fall away, revealing the same world you left behind. Fields, cottages, the distant line of the manor roof. Nothing has changed, but you feel different. You know their names now, you've walked their roads, stood beside their beds, held their stories in your hands, and you understand, perhaps for the first time, how all those quiet acts of control, even the ones that ended in sorrow, were not merely desperate, they were also defiant, a way of saying, "This life is mine," even if only for a breath. You stand for a long moment, the hush settling around you like a final benediction. You find a place to sit, where the grass is soft and the wind has gentled into a hush. Let your breath slow, let your shoulders unclench. The stories are still here, but they don't have to press so heavy on your heart. In this quiet, you can feel the shape of all those lives, so many women whose names never made it into the chronicles, whose choices were called sins, whose bravery was never celebrated. They are not asking you to forgive them, they are only asking to be remembered. Close your eyes. Picture the flicker of candlelight on a wooden floor, the dry rasp of herbs bundled in an apron, a hand pressed to a belly, willing the future to change. There is a kind of grace in that, even when the ending was harsh. With each slow breath, let the old judgments fade. Imagine their voices softer now, unburdened by fear. Imagine them gathering here in this hush, not to plead or confess, but simply to rest. No shame, no ledger, no punishment, just a long exhale after centuries of holding everything in. And as you rest here with them, let your own thoughts drift like the white petals falling through the dusk. You do not have to carry their sorrow any longer. Only the knowledge that they were here, that they mattered, that their choices were never as simple as the records claimed. Let that be enough. Now, when you're ready, open your eyes, breathe deep, feel the ground solid beneath you. You have come all this way through the quiet unraveling of their stories. Thank you for walking with me.